But cool, let's get started. So essentially, I think today's talk, it's quite obvious from the title. It's going to be an attacker's guide to AWS Access Keys. What I'm primarily going to cover is how, as attackers or offensive security professionals, we look at AWS access keys, right? How do we detect? Where do we find these access keys? Or how do we exploit and we get to these access keys? And once we get to these access keys, what can we do about it? Or what do we do? So just to talk a little bit about me, I'm Bharat. I mean, you can see my name. I work as a product security engineer at a fintech company. And just to mention, I'm an AWS certified security specialist. We'll quickly get started. But if we talk about access keys, right, these are credentials that you can use to that AWS will give you to have programmatic access or command line based access. Let's take a look at AWS access keys. And again, just to be very clear, when I say access keys, right, I'm talking about two things, which is again, it's meta, but AWS access keys. These are long-term, non-expiring credentials. Generally, these are tied to IAM user or your root user. So, and the second type of ones are temporary security credentials. These are provided by a service called as STS, short-term token service. And just to mention, what do AWS access keys look like, right? There are three components to an AWS access key. You have an access key ID, and there is a secret key. This is really important. It's a password. If you talk about like I was talking about long-term credentials, right? If you look at long-term credentials, you have only two components to it. You have access key ID, you have secret. But when you talk about temporary credentials, you have this third component called a session token, which actually sort of confirms how, or if the session is alive, if the token is alive or not, right? The tokens can have any length of time, but then it depends on the session token. So you have three components. All you need to do is remember this. The first one is a username. The second one, consider it as a password, and there is a session token. And the next thing, it is identifying access keys, right? AWS has a very whatever naming convention AWS has, it has a very clear, it has conventions. So you, as an attacker, if you are looking at AWS access keys, there are three things that you need to look at. If your key starts with any of these three, then it is an access key, and then it can have security ramifications. So AKIA is something that is assigned to IAM user, like I was mentioning. If something starts with AKIA, it is a long-living, non-expiring token, and you need to be really concerned. And there is ASIA, which is temporary credentials. We will see where we get these credentials. So these three are something that you need to be aware of. So coming to the attacker perspective, right? Now we have seen what AWS access keys are. What is sort of their format, opinion, or this is my experience from pentest. These are the places as an attacker I was able to find access keys. I was able to find AWS access keys in code repositories. These were leaked by developers accidentally. I was able to find AWS access keys or some information that will lead me to AWS access keys in application source code. There are people have hard-coded credentials, and I will also talk about a bunch of AWS services that indirectly lead you to AWS access keys. And then there is misconfigured CI/CD pipelines. Essentially, there is the whole left shift thing that is going on. People are setting up CI/CD pipelines. There are a bunch of places where these credentials can leak, and this is a very interesting place to look at because most of the credentials that I have gotten from misconfigured CI/CD pipelines gave me permissions that are close to admin. Again, this is my personal experience. And the other thing, I have not really been very successful. I mean, I have not found it a lot, but in certain pen tests, I have found this, which is you gain foothold to certain places where there could be credentials. Again, this is something that has happened only in red teaming engagements where we were able to gain access to dev workstations or their laptops or their development environment. And they had the credentials in the config files like I was talking about. But this is not something that I've found extensively. This is where I've found most of my credentials. And the most interesting thing, this is something I'll spend a lot of time on in the talk, is you can also find credentials by exploiting application vulnerabilities. So essentially, if you're hosting an application, at the end of the day, you're going to use cloud services to host applications. You can find certain vulnerabilities that will give you access to temporary credentials. So the first one, right? I mean, this is absolutely straightforward, which is if you have AWS access keys that are leaked in your Git repos or in your files or even in a file system, right? You gain access to a developer file system. If you want to look for AWS access keys, you can use tools that are based on regex or entropy. So my go-to tool is TruffleHog, and there is also Git leaks. And I also use grep a lot, which is basically grep that is written in Rust and it's super fast. So you can use these tools and you can find AWS access keys. This is where I'll spend most time. This is where we are jumping, which is exploiting uh, application set. And this is where I'll also go talk about a bunch of case studies. So essentially, we have talked about primarily, right? When I'm talking about truffle hog, it leaks and leaked credentials, right? Most of the times, the kind of credentials that I get access to in these pen tests, in this type of assessment, in this type of with this type of tools, right, is long-term security credentials. When you come to access attacking services, right, AWS services, you will be running into short-term credentials. For all intents and purposes, they're all the same. It just depends on what permissions these credentials have. You will be able to do similar things. It's just how you use it differs, and it's just how you access to it that differs. And this is where I'll also talk about a bunch of case studies from my past work and my present work on where we have found things. And I'll also talk about a bunch of pen tests that we have done. I think that adds value. Otherwise, I mean, this information is available anywhere, but the case studies, I think, is what adds more value. So we'll talk about AWS services now, right? EC2 is basically virtual machines. I'm sure you're aware of it. So if you have a web application hosted, or let's consider that you are doing a pen test for web applications that are hosted on EC2, EC2 instances have a concept called as instance profiles. Like I was talking about previously, if you have an EC2 instance where there's a web application running and it wants to talk to some other AWS services, right? And most valid case that I've seen is where you have an application running. Let's consider it's an HR system and it has to write files or social networking site, right? People put files and these files need to be written somewhere. Let's consider in the most basic terms, let's consider this application wants to write these files or store these files on an object store like S3. Your EC2, the most easy, the recommended way of doing it is use instance profiles. Essentially, instance profile is you are giving permissions to your EC2 instance. You're saying that, hey, you have the permissions to write to S3. And you can give any sort of permissions, right? You can even make your EC2 instance an admin. It doesn't matter. You can give any sort of permissions. But remember that in AWS, you can give permissions to services. In EC2, it's called instance profiles. So when you give a permission, let's consider in this case, EC2 has a permission, EC2 has an instance profile to access S3 buckets or anything like that, right? These credentials, again, these are temporary access keys. These are exposed via something called as instance metadata service. You don't need to know too much about it, but you can access it at this IP address. So 169.254, 169.254. Again, this is a private IP address. You will not be able to access it from outside. Every machine can access its own IP address. So if you are able to access this, you will be able to get credentials. And depending on the permissions that this machine has, you'll be able to do things. And what sort of vulnerabilities will help you gain access to IMDS v2? In EC2 case, you either need to find RCE. Again, you sort of something that I hear from people, if you found RCE, it's sort of game over. But again, if you're talking about plain RCE, right, you got access to the server. But now, if you got access to the server using RCE, and let's consider the most ridiculous case, right, which is the instance profile has an admin permission. Now you are able to pivot and become an admin on the cloud. And this is something I've done in the past. People tend to go with the easiest way. They'll try to give as much permissions as possible. In an ideal world, people should give least privilege, but that's not ideal world, right? You see people giving maximum permissions possible because that's an easy way out. So if you ever find like an RC and interesting vulnerability, this I think you must have read on a lot of bug bounty reports. You must have read a lot of blog posts, right? Is SSRF. If you find SSRF, basically SSRF is you having the capability to make your server request resources. I would, in plain terms, I would call it server-side browsing. Essentially, you're making your server, if you're browsing an application, you're making your server browse to other sites and fetch resources for you. A clean, good example of me exploiting it is image fetchers, right? There are a bunch of online services where you can give a URL and they'll be able to fetch like a screenshot of the web application. This is something I've exploited in the past. So if you have an application, again, I'll talk about this. Let's go to the case studies. I'll talk about it. So if you have an RC or if you have an SSRF, you'll be able to hit IMDS service at 169.254, 169.254, and you will be able to get temporary credentials. Again, you will gain access to temporary credentials. What you can do with it depends on the permissions. And in most cases, at the basic level, I was able to get access to all the S3 buckets. In the most ridiculous cases, I was able to gain access to like the admin accounts. Anyway, cool. So like I was talking about, again, there are two versions to it. When I talk about IMDS, right, there are two versions to it. IMDS V1 is the default. If you spin up an EC2 instance today, your metadata service will be using V1 service. I'll talk about what V2 is and how it is much more secure. So if you're on an EC2 machine, right, you can simply do curl to 169.254, and this is a standard path. You can go to metadata, you can go to IAM, you can go to security credentials. And if you browse to this, it will give you all the roles that this EC2 instance has, and then you can dump the credentials too. That's all I had for the talk. Thank you. End the session here.